January 1944, Camp Fort Bliss, Texas. The desert air is cold after sunset. Wind moves sand against wooden barracks. Somewhere beyond the barbed wire, a train horn echoes across the flat land. Inside one of the long huts, electric lights hum softly. German voices fill the room, not shouted commands. Not roll call. Measured sentences. Academic German. A chalkboard stands at the front. On it, written carefully in English and German, are mathematical formulas. Physics terms? Engineering diagrams. A captured Wehrmacht officer, once a university lecturer in Munich, holds the chalk. He wears a U.S.-issued prison uniform. Around him sit dozens of German prisoners of war. Some are former U-boat crewmen. Others fought in North Africa. A few were Luftwaffe mechanics. They sit on wooden benches, notebooks open, listening. Outside, guard towers loom. Searchlights sweep the fence. Inside, the lesson continues. This is not propaganda hour. This is not interrogation. This is not forced indoctrination. It is a university class sanctioned, supplied and protected by the United States Army. For the men in this room, the realization is unsettling. Their enemy is not trying to break them. Their enemy is trying to educate them, and that quiet contradiction will reshape everything that follows. By the winter of 1943, the Second World War had entered a new phase. The Axis advance had stalled. In North Africa, General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had been broken at El Alamein. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were no longer hunters alone, they were being hunted. Allied radar improved sonar and long-range patrol. Aircraft were closing the ocean gaps that once kept submarine crews safe. Every defeat carried consequences beyond the battlefield. German soldiers were no longer dying in place. They were surrendering, and increasingly they were being transported thousands of miles from the war they had fought. By mid-1943, the United States found itself custodian to an unprecedented number of enemy prisoners. Entire U-boat crews captured in the Atlantic. Afrika Korps divisions taken after Tunisia. Luftwaffe pilots shot down over Europe and transferred through Britain. One by one, ship after ship crossed the Atlantic, not with American soldiers going to war, but with German soldiers leaving it. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence or humiliation. The United States, with its vast territory and industrial capacity, was uniquely positioned to meet those obligations. By 1944, more than 425,000 German Poles were held in American custody. They were dispersed across a network of camps stretching from Texas and Oklahoma to Arizona, Colorado, Louisiana, and the Midwest. Some camps were purpose-built. Others were converted Army training facilities. All were guarded, regulated, and administered under War Department authority. For many American civilians, the sight was jarring. German soldiers, some still wearing fragments of their original uniforms, worked in fields, repaired roads, harvested crops, and lived behind fences in the heart of the United States. The war felt distant, yet suddenly present. Inside the camps, the prisoners themselves faced a deeper shock. They had expected revenge. They had expected brutality. Many had been warned by Nazi propaganda that capture by Americans would mean starvation, abuse, or execution. Instead, they received standardized meals, medical treatment, organized labor assignments, access to mail, and in time, something far more unexpected. Books. At first, the presence of reading material seemed incidental. The Geneva Convention permitted educational and recreational activities. Camp commanders allowed German-language novels, technical manuals, and newspapers vetted for security. But the American authorities soon noticed something critical. A large percentage of the captured Germans were not illiterate conscripts. They were trained specialists, engineers, chemists, teachers, architects, mechanics, university students. Interrupted by war, Germany, before 1939, had one of the most advanced education systems in the world. The prisoners carried that system with them. They organized informal study circles. They debated mathematics, philosophy, and engineering late into the night. They reconstructed lectures from memory. Some even recreated entire university syllabi using scraps of paper and shared notes. American intelligence officers and camp administrators began filing reports. These men were not broken. They were not passive. And they were not empty vessels. At the same time, a darker reality existed within the wire. Hardcore Nazi loyalists enforced ideological discipline among prisoners. Secret courts, intimidation, violence against those labeled disloyal or defeatist. The camps were not ideologically neutral spaces. They were battlegrounds of belief. The U.S. Army faced a dilemma. Simply guarding these men was not enough. Leaving them ideologically untouched meant risking the return of hardened extremists to post-war Europe. But overt propaganda would violate international law and provoke resistance. Somewhere between restraint and influence, a new idea began to take shape. An idea that did not rely on slogans or coercion. An idea rooted in classrooms instead of commands. That idea would soon redefine what captivity meant and set the stage for an experiment no nation had attempted before. By early 1944, the American POW camp system had become a vast, carefully managed machine. Each camp followed a standardized structure. Barracks arranged in neat rows. Guard towers at the perimeter. Roll calls conducted with procedural precision. Medical clinics staffed by U.S. Army doctors. Kitchens producing meals that, while simple, met caloric and nutritional requirements set by international law for many German prisoners. The routine itself was disorienting. Days were regulated but not brutal. Discipline existed, but arbitrary punishment did not. Prisoners worked often on nearby farms or infrastructure projects, but wages were credited to camp accounts, just as regulations required. They could buy extra food, toiletries, or writing supplies at camp canteens. The contrast with Nazi descriptions of Allied captivity was impossible to ignore. Yet beneath the surface, American officials remained uneasy. Reports from military intelligence units documented continued Nazi influence inside the wire. Certain barracks were dominated by party loyalists. Prisoner self-governance structures, initially allowed to maintain order, were sometimes used to intimidate dissenters. In extreme cases, prisoners suspected of rejecting Nazi ideology were assaulted or even killed by fellow Germans. The camps were quiet, but they were not neutral. The War Department understood the long-term implications. These men would not remain prisoners forever. The war would end. Germany would need to be rebuilt administratively, industrially, morally. The question was no longer how to hold them. It was what they would return as. In Washington, discussions began quietly, not framed as propaganda, not even as political conversion. The language used in memoranda was cautious, bureaucratic, and deliberate. The term chosen was reorientation. The goal was not to force loyalty to the United States, but to expose prisoners to alternative ways of thinking, democratic governance, rule of law, intellectual pluralism without violating the Geneva Convention. Education, American planners believed, offered a lawful path. The first step was containment of extremist influence. Prisoners identified as militant Nazis were separated and transferred to higher security camps. This reduced intimidation and created space for voluntary participation in intellectual programs. Then came the materials. Camp libraries expanded rapidly. Thousands of books were shipped from American universities, public libraries, and private donors. German language works on science, engineering, literature, and history appeared on shelves. English language books were introduced alongside them, encouraging language study, but the most radical decision was yet to come. Instead of American instructors teaching German prisoners, the U.S. Army approved a plan that shocked even some of its own officers. German posts would teach each other within the camps, were men who had once lectured at universities in Berlin, Heidelberg, and Munich. Professors of physics, doctors of law, engineers trained in some of the most rigorous academic systems in Europe. Under American supervision, they were allowed to organize formal courses, not discussion groups. Not casual tutoring. Structured classes, syllabi were written. Attendance was tracked. Exams were administered. In some camps, instruction ran 6 days a week. Subjects ranged from advanced mathematics and mechanical engineering to economics, literature, and foreign languages. Crucially, participation was voluntary. No prisoner was forced to attend. No grades affected privileges. The absence of coercion changed everything. Classes became spaces of choice, not control, for American guards. The sight was surreal. Men who had once fired machine guns now debated calculus. Former tank commanders studied civil engineering. U-boat officers translated English novels line by line. Struggling through unfamiliar grammar, the camps began to change. Violence decreased. Informant networks weakened. Prisoners who had once been silent began to question the narratives they had carried into captivity. Not because they were told to, but because education created distance from absolutism. Still, skepticism remained. Was this naive? Was it dangerous? Could education truly counter years of indoctrination? By mid-1944, those questions would be tested. The classroom experiment was about to expand beyond expectation, moving from improvised lectures to something far more ambitious and far more unsettling for the men behind the wire. The story now turns to the different forces at work inside those classrooms. The first angle through which this story must be understood is human for the German prisoners. Education inside captivity was not simply an activity. It was an interruption of identity. Many of the men sitting in those classrooms had defined themselves by service and rank. They had worn uniforms since adolescence. They had lived within rigid hierarchies where obedience was survival. War had stripped them of command, purpose, and certainty. Education returned something familiar. A physics equation did not care who won the war. A legal principle did not bend to ideology. A literature seminar allowed doubt to exist without punishment. For former students and academics, the classroom felt like a partial restoration of self. For others, it became their first encounter with intellectual freedom. Questions could be asked without consequences. Mistakes were corrected, not punished. This had emotional weight. Prisoners wrote in diaries that study made time move differently. Days felt shorter. The wire receded. The future became imaginable again, but education also fractured the prisoner population. Hardline Nazis viewed these classes with suspicion. Some dismissed them as weakness. Others feared what reflection might produce. Within certain compounds, attendance marked a man as unreliable. Quiet pressure followed. Whispered accusations. Occasional threats. The American policy of separating extremists reduced this danger, but it did not eliminate it. The act of learning became a moral decision. The second angle is moral. And it unsettled the Americans as much as the prisoners. For guards who had lost brothers in the war, the sight of enemy soldiers studying university material was difficult to accept. Letters home reflect confusion and resentment. Why were men who had fought against democracy now receiving its benefits? Camp commanders wrestled with the optics. Local newspapers sometimes criticized the programs. Farmers wondered why posts seemed better fed and better educated than some American laborers. Yet the policy held because the War Department understood something fundamental. Vengeance does not build stability. The United States was not planning for the next month. It was planning for the next generation. This was not charity. It was calculation. The third angle is psychological. Education introduced ambiguity into minds trained for certainty. Nazi ideology thrived on simplification, absolute enemies, absolute loyalty, absolute truths. Academic study undermined that framework quietly, without confrontation. History classes examined multiple sources. Economics courses discussed trade and scarcity without nationalist framing. Philosophy raised questions no doctrine could easily close. There were no lectures declaring Nazism false. There were no posters denouncing Hitler. The system relied on something more subtle, exposure. Prisoners encountered texts that assumed disagreement was natural. They learned that authority could be questioned without collapse. Over time, the rigidity many had carried into captivity softened. Not all changed. Some remained unmoved. But enough did that camp intelligence reports noted a shift in atmosphere. Discussions replaced arguments. Debate replaced slogans. Silence gave way to inquiry. The fourth angle is trust. Allowing POWs to organize classes required faith and restraint. Guards did not stand over every lecture. American oversight existed, but it was light by design. Excessive monitoring would have destroyed legitimacy. This trust unsettled the prisoners. They had been taught that power relied on fear, that authority demanded control. The absence of constant surveillance contradicted everything they had known. That contradiction lingered. Why would an enemy permit this? The answer was never spoken aloud inside the camps, but it was felt. Power did not always need force. By late 1944, the education program had altered the internal dynamics of several major camps. It had not ended conflict. It had not erased ideology, but it had created an alternative. Space one where the future intruded on the present. Yet these angles only tell part of the story. Beyond the human and moral dimensions lay deeper strategic calculations, decisions made far from the barbed wire, by men who saw education not as mercy, but as a long-term instrument of influence. Those calculations now come into focus. The fifth angle is strategic. From the perspective of American planners, the education of German prisoners was never isolated from the broader war effort. It was part of a continuum that extended beyond victory on the battlefield and into the architecture of peace. By 1944, Allied leaders were already planning for Germany's defeat. The question was not if, but what kind of Germany would emerge afterward. A nation devastated physically could be rebuilt. A nation shattered morally and intellectually posed a far greater risk. The United States had learned this lesson after the First World War. The punitive settlement of 1919 had left resentment, instability, and ideological extremism. This time, American policymakers sought a different outcome. Education was not about absolution, it was about preparation. Men trained in engineering could rebuild infrastructure. Men exposed to democratic ideas could staff local administrations. Men accustomed to debate could resist authoritarian resurgence. The POW camps became laboratories for this vision. The sixth angle is technological and institutional. The United States did not simply permit education, it organized it with characteristic efficiency. Camp administrators cataloged prisoner qualifications. Those with advanced degrees were identified. Teaching materials were standardized. Course lists were approved through the Special Projects Division, an office created specifically to manage intellectual and cultural programs for POWs. Some camps went further. At Camp Van Etten in Mississippi and Camp Fort Eustis in Virginia, curricula mirrored those of American technical schools. Mechanical engineering, electrical theory, and agricultural science courses addressed practical reconstruction needs. In Texas camps, English language instruction became widespread, using American textbooks rather than translated German ones. Certificates of completion were issued. While they did not carry official academic credit, they documented study and competency. Prisoners treated them with seriousness. The seventh angle is the enemy's perspective. Not all German prisoners welcomed the program. To committed Nazis, education represented contamination. American democracy was seen as weak, chaotic, and morally suspect. Some prisoners boycotted classes entirely. Others attended but resisted internally, treating lessons as temporary distractions. Yet even resistance carried consequences. Listening to alternative viewpoints even unwillingly introduced cracks. Some prisoners later admitted that it was not the content of the classes that changed them, but the environment, the absence of ideological enforcement. The freedom to disagree, that freedom was disarming. The eighth angle is control versus autonomy. American authorities deliberately avoided framing the program as re-education. That word implied coercion. Instead, autonomy was emphasized. Prisoners selected courses. Teachers were fellow Germans. Authority rested in knowledge, not force. This approach minimized backlash. It also revealed a quiet truth. Ideology struggles to survive where curiosity is allowed. The ninth angle is unintended. Consequence. As prisoners grew more educated, they became more self-aware. They discussed war crimes. They questioned orders they had followed. Some expressed guilt. Others expressed anger not at the Allies, but at the regime that had led them into catastrophe. This was not the outcome every American planner had anticipated. The program had not simply prepared future administrators, it had humanized the war's aftermath. By late 1944, reports from camp psychologists and intelligence officers converged on a single observation. The classrooms had become turning points, but the true transformation did not occur gradually. It came suddenly. In 1945, as news filtered through the camps that the Third Reich was collapsing, the meaning of education shifted overnight from distraction to lifeline. That moment, when the future became unavoidable, marks the decisive turning point of this story. January 1945 arrived with a different atmosphere inside the camps. The winter was harsher than usual across much of the United States. Snow fell in regions unaccustomed to it. Rail lines slowed. Letters from Europe arrived less frequently, and when they did, their tone had changed. Rumors moved faster than official notices. The Red Army was advancing from the east. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. Cities once considered untouchable were now rubble. For the first time, even the most committed prisoners understood what the silence meant. Germany was losing. American authorities did not announce the collapse of the Third Reich. They did not need to. Newspapers, carefully vetted but factual, were made available. Maps were updated. Radio broadcasts filtered in fragments of truth. The effect inside the classrooms was immediate. Attendance increased. Men who had once dismissed education as temporary now crowded benches. Courses expanded. Evening lectures extended late into the night. Engineering classes turned practical. Economics discussions shifted from theory to reconstruction. Law seminars debated accountability. Education was no longer a pastime. It was preparation for survival. Within the camps, a transformation took hold. Prisoners who had once spoken only of return now spoke of responsibility, of ruined cities, of families displaced, of a Germany that would require builders rather than soldiers. American officers noticed the change. Reports from Camp Fort Bliss, Camp Bowie, and Camp McCain documented rising enrollment and declining disciplinary incidents. Guards who had once been skeptical acknowledged that the atmosphere had stabilized. The U.S. Army formalized what had begun as an experiment. In early 1945, several camps received authorization to expand academic programs to what were effectively university-level systems. Structured departments emerged: engineering, mathematics, sciences, humanities. Libraries doubled in size. Teaching schedules resembled civilian institutions. The irony was impossible to miss. Behind barbed wire, German prisoners experienced a level of intellectual freedom that had been absent in their homeland for years. American oversight remained constant but restrained. Courses were reviewed. Political indoctrination was prohibited. But the content itself remained rigorous, serious, and authentic. For many prisoners, this was the first time the war had forced them to confront its consequences intellectually. History courses addressed the Weimar Republic. Economics lectures examined inflation and collapse. Ethics discussions, though careful, touched on obedience and responsibility. Not all participated willingly. Some remained silent. Others refused entirely. But the momentum was irreversible. The camps had crossed a threshold. The war, once defined by weapons and territory, had entered the minds of those who would live with its aftermath. By April 1945, as Allied forces liberated concentration camps in Europe, the distance between rumor and reality collapsed. Photographs circulated. Testimonies emerged. Denial became harder to maintain. In the classrooms, discussions grew quieter, more serious, less defensive. The education program had not been designed for this moment, but it absorbed it. Then came May. Germany surrendered. The announcement reached the camps not with celebration, but with a heavy stillness. For many prisoners, it was the first moment they truly felt defeated, not militarily, but existentially. The question that followed was unspoken but universal. What now? The answer would not come from guards or commanders. It would come from the very classrooms that had once seemed so strange. But the decisive transformation was still unfolding, one that would redefine captivity itself and leave a legacy few had anticipated.